Hi, this time I'm going to talk about Vampire Hunter D. This video is going to contain some minor spoilers, nothing climactic, but some things that represent some of the aspects of the world. I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics and psychology of some of the characters. So many of those things are kind of like saying Clark Kent is Superman type of spoiler, so it's nothing really too big. But as I was telling you, I'm going to avoid all the climactic elements of different books, original video animations, etc. Now, in the description below, I'm going to put a few videos that of the original video animations that will express some of the creepy and some of the action-packed scenes of Vampire Hunter D. But I recommend that you watch those videos if you have never experienced or you don't know about Vampire Hunter D. I recommend that you watch this video first and then watch those videos, or otherwise things are going to look a bit confusing. Well, what is Vampire Hunter D? Vampire Hunter D is all about the adventures of this awesome, suave, mysterious, creepy vampire hunter, half human, half vampire, in a world that is quite difficult to describe. It's actually, at first glance, it looks like somewhat of a standard setting, but it's actually quite complex in its composition. I would define it as a Wild West, post apocalyptic, science fantasy, horror setting, to put it in a way. To understand this world of Vampire Hunter D, I think we should start by looking at a prequel book that is actually one of the newer ones, that is called Noble 5, or maybe Noble V, I'm not exactly sure, I think it's Noble 5, Grey Lancer. Let me see if I can get that into focus. Okay. Now, Grey Lancer is a prequel for the entire Vampire Hunter D saga. The basic plotline is this. At one point in time, humanity was completely dominated by vampires. But these vampires are somewhat different. They are not exactly like a human being that was transformed into an undead creature. They are more like a separate race, a very advanced race. These vampires pretty much surpass humanity in every aspect, and they surpass them in technology, in aesthetics, in some philosophical currents. They're just incredibly superior, and physically, well, they are almost like superheroes when compared to humans. They are faster, stronger, etc. They have a few weaknesses, some of the standard ones that you already know concerning vampires. And of course, they feed on humans. Humans are basically like cattle to them. And vampires have no empathy towards humans. They see them like just like food, as you would expect. And so you should forget about some things that have been handled in modern vampire themes and settings. That is, forget about Twilight. Please forget about Twilight. So here, vampires, they have no feelings towards humans. There are a very few weird, very rare exceptions, but for the most part, these vampires are monsters. And as I was telling you, they follow the classic vampire weaknesses and powers, because the author, Hideyuki Kikuchi, is a fan of Hammer horror films. Vampire Hunter D was in fact inspired by those films and by Captain Kronos specifically. So there are many things that you would recognize from classic horror. As to the setting, well, Grey Lancer starts with humans completely dominated by vampires. Vampires have castles and cities, and humans they are pretty bad. They're down on their luck. They are less than peasants. They are treated like animals, as I was telling you. But there's a slight hint of vampires because being nobles, that is, they consider themselves the true nobility, and so even though they have humans like treat them as cattle, they still like feel they need to protect them as as a rancher or a farmer would protect his animals or his crops. So in Grey Lancer, you see that vampires are at war with these beings known as the let me see OSBs, which are basically the outer space beings. And this is not exactly like open war, at least not at first, but it's more like covert ops or secret war type of thing. And Grey Lancer is one of the most powerful vampires. He's incredibly skilled and powerful. And maybe you're asking, why are we talking about Grey Lancer? If this video is about Vampire Hunter D. We'll get into that. And so a Grey Lancer, he's sort of like the most powerful and skilled agent tasked with finding out about these OSBs and destroying them, or finding out what they are trying to do to planet Earth. And you gain a lot of insight of the psychology of a vampire. That is, Grey Lancer is a true anti-hero. He has no remorse. If a human is standing in the way of one of his attacks when he's fighting those outer space beings, he will feel no remorse. If he will cut down both alien and human alike. And you see how Grey Lancer feels almost no empathy towards humans. That slightly shifts a bit at the middle of the book, but for the most part you really get a good sense of how vampires are so different and so cold, to put it in a way, towards humans. And the battles are awesome because vampires, being superior to humans physically and mentally, they engage in some pretty insane battles. There is a scene where Grey Lancer is pretty much like piloting sort of like a space chariot, and he's going at tremendous speed. Imagine like a Death Star run in Star Wars, but like 10 times faster. It kind of feels like that. And he's fighting with his spear, the one he's wielding right here. And he does a lot of awesome things. And the book actually ends up with a cliffhanger of sorts. So I really hope that they release the second volume. That is, they translate it to English. The book overall is great. However, I didn't know that the Japanese version actually had some pretty cool looking illustrations. The same illustrator that worked with Castlevania, I forget her name. She was Kojima was her last name, I think. Ayame Kojima. I'm not really sure, but she's the one that illustrated Castlevania, and she also does the illustrations for Grey Lancer. So it's a shame that this book doesn't have the awesome looking illustrations. So as you can see, vampires are the nobility and they rule over humans, and all of their high-tech cities and everything that makes that creates a civilized world is because of vampires. But there is a point in history, maybe that will be revealed in future novels, where humans got a bit of the upper hand. Not exactly. I think it's, and sorry, that's a wrong way to put it. It's more like vampires fell into decadence. Maybe it's a result of their fight against the outer space beings. And these outer space beings feel a bit like John Carpenter's The Thing. But there is a point in the timeline where vampires lose their power, they start dying, they become like an endangered species of sorts, and of course humans capitalize on this. And humans, even though they are quite fragile and weak when compared to vampires, because of the necessity of trying to survive, they develop some interesting skills and technology of their own. You will see humans that have some sort of telekinesis, to put it in a way, and in which they can control the way their arrows or crossbow bolts fly. Because, for example, if you watch one of the videos below, you will see a human using his crossbow, and it's just so incredibly over the top and astonishing how he shoots all those crossbow bolts, and he probably wields some sort of psionic power, to put it in a way, or maybe some sort of other technology that we haven't seen before. And so even though humans have all those awesome abilities and technology, they still feel quite weak when compared to a true noble. There's also a fighting technique known as the Streda fighting style with swords that I cannot say exactly what it is because it's a spoiler, but that's probably one of my favorite human techniques. Um, so, well, after that, when vampires fell into decadence, humans started to try to rebuild their society, and this is where the Wild West aspect of the setting comes in, because it's very hard after being dominated by vampires and kept almost like in caveman sort of state. Humans had to rebuild everything, so they started with villages and cities, but they have a Wild West feel to them. At most, they feel a bit Victorian. So you're going to see a lot of both primitive and high-tech things. You're going to see cities that look like everything is made out of wood, but every now and then you have some high-tech devices with circuits and metals and whatnot, and some technology that is simply science fantasy, that it's over the top, and you never get a feeling that they explain it completely, but that's the way things work. So humans, as they try to thrive in this post-apocalyptic setting, they see that there are still many supernatural and horrible things in the world. You're going to see werewolves. You're going to see, of course, the last vampires that appear every now and then, and mutants. There are many mutants. There's even an entire city of mutants, the Barbaroid, which is shown in the second original video animation that I will talk about in a bit. And those mutants aren't just like monstrous mutants. They also have like psychic powers. They feel a bit like the X-Men, but a very nightmarish version of the X-Men. And so humans realize that they need hunters and warriors, fighters to protect them from these creatures. And so many types of specialized hunters appear, like vampire hunters, werewolf hunters. I imagine that there are also mutant hunters, etc. And some of, as told in the books, you actually get a really cool sense of everything that some humans look really badass. And the way that things are presented from their perspective, it's also quite exciting. Because, for example, I remember there is a scene in one of the books where these three humans are descending down a cave where there are a lot of like toxic fumes and smoke and such, and they are wearing these gas masks and these suits that feel like they combine new things with old things. So you imagine them all rusty and brownish and all, and they're like breathing, and when they go into the tunnels they can't see anything, and they're facing off against creatures out of a nightmare that can tear you to pieces, shred you in a matter of seconds, perhaps even less, and you really feel like somewhat like frightened and tense, because they're just armed with some sort of like a rail gun, but that's really not as powerful as the things that these creatures can do. So it's a cool thing that they give you the perspective of a fragile human, because it feels quite exciting. Because when things are told from the perspective of Vampire Hunter D, you're going to feel like a superhero. I'll tell you why. Let's talk about the character Vampire Hunter D. I actually have the it's a bit dusty, my Vampire Hunter D figure. And this is one from the sword is actually pretty cool. It almost has like that metallic sound that you see in movies. It looks really cool. And this is a figure inspired in the second video animation. Well, Vampire Hunter D is basically a half human, half vampire hunter. That is, he hunts vampires, but he's half human and half vampire. And I think there's a bit of a confusion with the term, because first, when Vampire Hunter D first came out, they were saying, I think they said vampire, and then they said it was a dampire, and then they said it's a Don Peel. That is the term that describes someone who is half human and half vampire. But I think it's an error of translation, because in Japan sometimes they pronounce the R as an L. So if they say like ramen, it's ramen, romanized. So I think it was Dampir, because I've seen it in some Serbian books. The term Dampir, that is a true creature of folklore that is half vampire, half human, that actually fights against vampires, so it makes sense that they become hunters. And so it ended up as Don Peel. And so Don Peels are quite popular as vampire hunters because they have a lot of the vampire's strengths and some of their weaknesses, but not all of them. So, for example, Vampire Hunter D. Let me see if I can get a good image. Well, Vampire Hunter D, he can walk in the broad daylight for some hours without getting killed by the sunlight. So those are some of the advantages that you get as a dumb pill, but you also have a lot of strength and speed and whatnot. But Vampire Hunter D is an exception. He's an extraordinary individual when compared to other dumb pills. And that's a bit of the mystery. It's not as much. Many of the fans already know why, but well, to put it into perspective, many of the true vampires of the of the nobles, they look at Vampire Hunter D with a sort of like a contempt, like, oh, you're the son of a lecherous nobleman and a human peasant. Oh, you half-breed, you mongrel or whatever. But you kind of later on, it is revealed who is the father of Vampire Hunter D. I bet that you already know who is the father of Vampire Hunter D. So, and that's some of the coolest parts in the books and in the movies when this bad guy that feels so superior to Vampire Hunter D. Oh, you're just like a kid and all that. And when he actually realizes the truth, oh no, you're the son of it, like that, he's going to be like, ooh! Because there are some prominent vampires amongst the nobles. In nobility, there are vampires that are almost like worshipped like gods because of their power. In fact, there is one that is known as the vampire, the sacred ancestor, and you already know who that vampire is. I know it. So, as I was telling you, it's going to be quite a bit of a shocker. Most of the Vampire Hunter D fans already know that, but when the reveal comes out, you're like, oh, that's so awesome, so cool. And Vampire Hunter D actually has a special thing about him, because this is a post-apocalyptic setting. Well, there's a lot of like nuclear energy and whatnot, and he actually has a parasite, a mutation in his hand. You can see, let me see if I can get that into focus. You can see the face in the hand. You even have a hand that you can switch for that one when it opens its mouth. Here it is. And this hand is Vampire Hunter D's sidekick. He talks with Vampire Hunter D, and he's actually somewhat mischievous and at times somewhat annoying. Although, for one who is reading the books and watching the original video animations, it's actually one of the coolest characters. That is, it's sort of like a comedy relief, and the hand is always like nagging at D and just pestering him, trying to get into his mind, playing mind games with him. But this hand is also a source of great power for D. He does so many extraordinary things with it. They look quite magical. The hand can swallow the attacks and powers and whatnots of enemies. Even, for example, if someone tosses like a bunch of deadly spiders at D, the hand can basically swallow them all. And this hand also swallows spells. In one book, one of my favorite books, which is the Racer of Gales. Let me see if I can... I have like 13 or 14 books of Vampire Hunter. Here it is. In this volume, there is a very cool power Vampire Hunter D does with his hand. And you can see many things that he can do, like attacks, but he can also like move between dimensions. It's a very useful parasite. And that's another cool thing of Vampire Hunter D as a character. You never know what to expect of the things that he knows. Because he is the son of a certain vampire, he has access to many extraordinary powers, ancient technologies and techniques. So, for example, as you can see here in this figure, I don't know if I can get that into focus. Oops. There's that necklace, that blue necklace over there. That's actually let me see if I can. Okay, that's actually like a talisman of sorts that identifies him as the son of that guy, but at the same time it's also like a technological device of sorts. It activates and deactivates defense mechanisms in vampire castles, because this is a science fantasy setting. All of the vampire castles, they look quite ancient, but at the same time they're going to have like automated doors and teleporters and elevators and whatnot. So it's funny, somewhat strange, because you're going to see a lot of Bela Lugosi type of things inside those castles and Hammer horror films, but you're going to see a lot of high-tech things as well. That's something that I really enjoy of the setting of Vampire Hunter D. Like I mentioned in my other video where I talked about Lovecraft, I'm going to put a link in the description below in case you haven't seen that one. One of the things that I enjoyed a lot about Lovecraft is that he always shows you something, just a bit or a detail of a place or some sort of strange being, of some sort of ritual, but he never tells you everything about that. It's going to be like, oh, the ancient city of whatnot, or the temple of who knows what, but you just get like a glimpse of that place. Sometimes the character never visits that area, and you always want to know more about that. And in Vampire Hunter D, in the books and in the movies, it's the same thing. You always see these huge forests or these abandoned temples, these cities. So for example, in Vampire Hunter D Bloodlust, in this one, there is a castle, of a very famous female vampire, and you want the characters to explore that place. You want them to go inside that castle and go into the rooms and see what types of nightmarish creatures exist there, but they just explore a very tiny portion of that area, and you're always left like wanting more. You actually, in this video game for the PlayStation 1, Vampire Hunter D, which a lot of people consider is a terrible game, you actually get to experience quite a bit of the castle. You can even see the castle here in the city here. This is the instruction manual. and you get to explore that castle. However, as I was telling you, it's not exactly the best of games. The instruction manual is actually pretty cool. You get a lot of like illustrations of the characters. The castle is not that great. There are just a lot of rooms that look the same, so it was slightly disappointing. But still, you get to fulfill a bit of your fantasy of exploring the different rooms of the castle. So as I was saying, where was I? Oh yeah, the vampires and the parasite of the hand. Another thing that I really like of D is that you get to understand a bit of his psychology from the perspective of an immortal, because he's half vampire. Who knows how many centuries Vampire Hunter D has existed. There is a scene in one of the books where he's fighting against these horrifying flying creatures, and one of them starts attacking this little girl, and Vampire Hunter D, like, he hesitates for a split second because he's trying to find out who is causing the whole mess in that city. It's actually a floating city. And he decides to help the girl, but you wonder, why did he hesitate? Why didn't he try to help her right away? And he helps the little girl, and he goes again away trying to investigate who is causing all the mess and all that. And later on, a few chapters later, you see the little girl dead. And then you understand Vampire Hunter D, because he has seen so many people dying, he almost has like a sense of boredom or pointlessness, that what is the point of saving humans if they are going to die, if they are so fragile and the world is filled with so many horrifying creatures. So you see or notice a bit of the struggle of D trying to keep moving on centuries and centuries, still keeping like a sense of justice and hope and optimism. So, and when comparing Vampire Hunter D as presented in the books with the movies, Vampire Hunter D, this is the first original video animation. Vampire Hunter D feels a lot more mercenary in the books. In the movies, he's actually presented like a very likable type of guy, despite his taciturn and brooding and moodish behavior. But for example, in these movies, he feels a lot like more friendly towards humans. But in the books, he's always like, for example, if someone hires him to kill a vampire, he's going to be like, okay, but that's still not enough, and I'm just going to kill this vampire, and that's it. And he never goes like the extra mile as opposed to the first original video animation. And even though in Bloodlust, in the second movie, he does have that attitude that we're going to pay you like $10 million. No, not dollars, it's dollars. I think, I don't know exactly how much that is, but it sounds like a lot. And he's like, okay, but that's not enough, and they have to double the price. And so, as I was telling you, in the books, he feels a lot more like a mercenary type of character. While in the movies, he's a bit more likable. Well, that's somewhat relative because you have to consider the setting and the world. Many of the characters in Vampire Hunter D they are trying to survive, and life is not life is cheap, but the things that you do in life they are not. So they're always trying to get a bit of earning something despite the difficult and deadly situations. Now, for those of you that have only watched this movie and who have not yet read the books, there are some important differences. This movie, Vampire Hunter D, is based on the first novel, Vampire Hunter D, Volume 1. But there are some very important differences. I have like a mixed opinion of both of them. I do not know exactly which I like the most. Because let's take a look at the movie, the first video animation, technically speaking. The art for that time is pretty good. However, I do not like the look of some of the women because they have like this huge head, almost doll-like head at times, and their eyes sometimes look quite big when compared to the eyes of men in the movie. So I have mixed opinion on the look of the movie. Although the world, I think it looks pretty good, pretty weird and moody and bleak. But there are also some puzzling choices. But I think it was to make the movie more appealing to the masses. Maybe that's why Vampire Hunter D is still a bit like a cult classic, because they don't compromise the setting. They're not trying to create a setting that everybody likes. They're trying to create the Vampire Hunter D setting. And one of the things is that there is the female character, the female lead in this movie, which is Doris, I think. There's a very small image. You're going to see her in the trailer. It's the blonde girl with a whip. There's actually a lot like inspiration between Vampire Hunter D and Castlevania, the old school Castlevania video games, because you're going to see elements of Castlevania and Vampire Hunter D and vice versa. And well, Doris in Vampire Hunter D, the movie, the original video animation, well, she's a blonde woman who has sort of like a heroine vibe to her. She's quite helpless at times, but she's got like the female lead. But in the book, you can see this blonde girl over here. She's actually a vampire. And she's the only female vampire that is featured in Vampire Hunter D OVA. But the book presents the female vampire to be more like the female lead. That is, I think she's called Lamika. And Lamika feels more like the heroine of the book. She's presented in a more likable light, and you will see why by the end of the book. You will also see why by the end of Vampire Hunter D. But I don't know, like they kind of like switched the roles. For example, Doris is quite different physically and psychologically in this book when compared to the original video animation. So I at times I don't know why they made that change, but I think it was to present the movie to appeal more people slightly. So because if you see like a Vampire Hunter D who is acts more like a hero towards the female vampire, you're going to be like that's somewhat weird. So I think that they say no, let's put the female character to be more under the spotlight so that people like the movie more. There are a lot of there's another negative thing about the Vampire Hunter D film? Well, it depends, but I think most fans agree that the English dub of this version, the first English dub, because I heard that they are redubbing this film, it's quite terrible. There are some performances that I like, but you're going to see like a lot of cheesy, like a Romanian accent, like like, and I'm pretty sure that the same guy that does the voice for Vampire Hunter D does the voice for the hand, the parasite, and it sounds quite bad at times. Sometimes his Vampire Hunter D is like the hands. It says something like "Careful, D, you're walking into a trap," and Vampire Hunter D is like, "I know." So, but you can tell that it's the same voice actor, like just holding his nose like that. And so the dubbing in English is quite terrible, and I think the Japanese voice is better, but I cannot tolerate the voice of Doris. She's just like really high pitched. She's like really annoying. Really, by the end of the movie, there is this scene where she's like screaming Vampire Hunter D's name, that is D, and she's D, and you're like, oh my ears. Almost like that. So I have a bit of a mixed opinion when it comes to the technical side of this original video animation. Despite that, I think that this is one of my favorite movies. When I first saw it, I knew that Vampire Hunter D was going to be like one of my favorite characters of all time. So it's very worth watching the movie. And to give you an idea of the plotline, Doris is basically protecting her home from different creatures, mutants, and some sort of like plasma ghosts of sort. They're quite weird. But she walks into the domain of Magnus Lee, a very powerful vampire, and she kind of like marks her to be her bride. She bites Doris, and he bites Doris, and she's marked like, I'm going to begin the courting process of a vampire, of draining your blood slowly every night. And so she hires Vampire Hunter D. And this is one of the few cases, both in the movie and in the book, where Vampire Hunter D acts as somewhat, what would you say, merciful towards a human, because she's somewhat poor. She cannot afford Vampire Hunter D. As I was telling you, they usually, you have to pay like $10 million for dollars per vampire. So depends on the strength of the vampire. So she basically tells him that she can only pay him by giving him 3 meals a day, and he can have sex with her if he wants. But that's another interesting thing of Vampire Hunter D, because he is half vampire. I don't think he has a very active sex life, because he always, when he's with a woman, he starts turning into a monster. Vampire Hunter D is described by many as a very handsome a man, to the point that he kind of gets men confused, as they get like, oh, this guy too pretty, like he's the ultimate pretty boy, to put it in a way. But when he transforms, kind of like goes berserk into his vampire side, he becomes quite monstrous. For example, I think this cover could give you a bit of an example of the type of expression that he gets, but it's even more terrifying. Like he snarls and his fangs come out and his eyes start shining creepily. So Vampire Hunter D cannot. I've never seen him have sex in a book or in the films. He's always like trying to restrain himself, and the few times that a female character, has pretty much tossed herself into his arms, he's kind of like almost about to bite her, and he has to keep his distance from that character. So that makes Vampire Hunter D a bit of a tragic character. And so in the movie, you're going to see Vampire Hunter D protecting Doris and going into the castle of this vampire, and a lot of interesting and creepy things happen. And as I was telling you, I still don't know which one I like the most, the movie or Volume 1, because there are things that I like and I dislike. Another thing that I somewhat dislike is that in the book, there is a mutant, Regency, I think he was called, and he appears also in the movie. And I think the book gives him too much attention. In the movie, I think he's portrayed quite excellently. So he's a mutant with a very unusual power, and he gives Vampire Hunter D quite a bit of trouble. But maybe because of I was telling you of that aspect of boredom of Vampire Hunter D, that sometimes he gets. It's not that he becomes too arrogant or negligent. It's kind of like he gets too bored at times and he makes some mistakes. But because Vampire Hunter D is so powerful, you always know that he's going to come out of trouble in the end in some way. He just has that feeling of being almost invincible. Now let's talk a bit about the second original video animation, which is Bloodlust. I actually like the aesthetics of Bloodlust a lot more than the other movie. Without the sleeve, it looks quite cool. I'm going to put a couple of trailers for Bloodlust and a video in the description below. And in Bloodlust, I think it goes a bit closer to the novels in the sense that in the novels you look at things from the human's perspective, sometimes from the perspective of a victim of a human hunter. And Vampire Hunter D at times feels like a secondary character, but a very badass secondary character. And I like that way that it jumps between one style of to another, because when you are looking at things from the perspective of a human, you feel like at risk, and it's kind of like the horror aspect of things. But when the story switches to Vampire Hunter D, to his perspective of things, you feel almost like a superhero. And I think that in both the books and the movie, makes some of the villains slightly forgettable. Although in Bloodlust, most of the villains there are quite original, in my opinion. That is, you still remember them, of what makes them powerful, sometimes obnoxious, and you remember them. But in the books, many of the enemies, which are mutants, vampires, werewolves, monsters, ghosts, etc., 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 they seem somewhat forgettable because D is just so incredibly powerful. Too powerful, even though they have all these crazy abilities that they shoot lightning, or that they move at incredible speed, or that they can twist time and space and etc. Vampire Hunter D just surpasses them incredibly. Vampire Hunter D is almost never on the run, unless he is being hired to help someone to escape or to escort someone. Vampire Hunter D is always chasing down the villains. He feels almost like the monster of the stories. These mutants, vampires, and whatnot are going to be almost like running away from Vampire Hunter D, because they know that if they fight against Vampire Hunter D, they are going to lose. They have no chance of winning against Vampire Hunter D. And some of the powers of Vampire Hunter D, well, he's incredibly fast, exaggeratedly strong. His sword is made out of who knows what. A few times his sword has broken, but most of the time he kind of cuts through steel as if it were butter. He has this awesome looking horse that at times gets killed, but he's sort of kind of like a cybernetic horse of sorts, and he has to replace his equipment every now and then. And it feels like and they have no chance against Vampire Hunter D, and those foolish enough to think that, oh, he's this half vampire, half human, oh, he's such a peasant compared to us, they make a huge mistake. And Vampire Hunter D is always going to win. You get that sense. Even when he gets in trouble, you're always sure that he's going to overpower his enemy. And in Bloodlust, the plotline enhances this, because at the start of the movie you get this. You don't get all the story that is all what's behind of what happened, but they tell you that this woman was kidnapped by this vampire known as Meyerling, who is somewhat of an eccentric among vampires, because he is very nice to humans. He has never harmed humans. You can take a look at Meyerling here. Let me see, it's in the third novel. Here it is. Here he doesn't look as badass as in the movie. In the movie he looks incredibly cool. Let me see if I can get an illustration of him. Meyerling. Well, this is a very small image. You will see him in the trailer below. better. But he's this guy over here with like that black claw, and he also appears in the prequel novel Grey Lancer. He's pretty awesome there, well as well. However, when I compare Bloodlust with the novel, it was inspired from in Demon Death Chase. Meyerling isn't as cool in this novel. He's way cooler in Grey Lancer, but in Demon Death Chase, his performance is quite disappointing in my opinion. There, he has some pretty anticlimactic moments to say the least. But in Bloodlust, he's a badass. In fact, Bloodlust is not inspired in just Volume 3 of Vampire Hunter D. This is inspired in. It has elements of two other books, in my opinion. I think that when compared to the first original video animation, Bloodlust deviates quite a bit from the source material, and I think it was for the better because this volume doesn't do justice to the characters, and I think that this movie does that pretty well. So as I was telling you, apparently Meyerling kidnapped this woman, and Dee gets hired to do that. But the family of the kidnapped girl also hires the Marcus brothers, and that's another thing that I thought was quite radical in the translation between the movie and the novel. In the novel, the Marcus brothers are quite dislikable. They are almost thuggish in their personality. Seriously. They're kind of like criminals. Just read that volume and you're not going to like the Marcus brothers at all. But in the movie, the Marcus brothers feel like the main characters almost of the film, and they're quite likable in a way. I think it was for the better. And I'm going to put a scene where they fight against a lot of vampire zombie type of creatures, and you're going to see that they look pretty badass. And they have so many incredible weapons and skills and powers. So that's the special thing of Bloodlust. It feels like a race between Vampire Hunter D and the Marcus brothers, and you have to unravel that mystery of why Meyerling kidnapped this woman. In general, if you were thinking of should I watch the movies or read the books, well, I would recommend that you do both. But if you have to choose, I think that the books in general are quite good and presenting the setting, more things about Vampire Hunter D and such. But I still think that Yoshitaka Amano doesn't manage to create memorable villains. As I was telling you, there are so many monsters and so many villains because Vampire Hunter D is so awesome both in his backstory and his skills and powers and all of that, he overshadows them by quite a bit. And I also found it quite interesting that the origin of D differs a bit in the movies and in the books, because in the books Vampire Hunter D feels more like a product of science, of weird science. He feels like he's an experiment of a certain vampire. And although you get the feeling that there was a bit of perhaps love or affection in Vampire Hunter D's birth, he feels more like an experiment. He sometimes actually encounters his father at times, or at least like sort of like a projection or shade of his father, because he has so many powers, Vampire Hunter D's father. And at times his father also even tells him, "You were my only success." Like maybe there were other Vampire Hunter D's created that is half vampire, half humans, who were he tried to create like the ultimate vampire of sorts. But in the movies, it feels more like a thing of a love between a vampire and a human woman, and it doesn't feel that much of an experiment. So all in all, I recommend that you get into Vampire Hunter D, even if you want to watch the movies or read the books. I also know that there's manga, but I've never read the Vampire Hunter D manga. There was also a rumor that was going to be an anime series in 2017. We'll have to see if that's true. If there's actually an anime series, I hope it turns out pretty good and they manage to fix some things of the books, because some of the books are cool. They have a lot of surreal things. You're going to see so many weird science, horrific, Wild West type of things. But as I was telling you, for example, the Marcus Brothers, the Marcus Brothers in the books are terrible, and but in Bloodlust they are pretty cool. So I think they take some take action on some of those elements in the books that you do not like. The books are still ongoing. I have yet to read like 10 or perhaps 15 of them. I need to catch up on my Vampire Hunter D, and as I was telling you, I hope that they release the second volume of Grey Lancer. And I actually think that the books of Vampire Hunter D would be a lot better if they were translated by the guy who translated this one. I don't think he is the same guy that translated the Vampire Hunter D books. If he is, then he must have gone through some pretty radical change, because now it's another guy. It's a Japanese guy called Takami Nieda. I think he does a superb job of translating Grey Lancer, because the translator for Vampire Hunter D, let's see if it says here. Kevin Leahy, or Lehi, I don't know how you pronounce that. Well, Kevin does a decent job in my opinion, but there are some things that I think were lost in translation. Some things that, oh, and that looks cute, or that looks horrifying, that I thought that isn't cute at all, or that isn't horrifying at all. But here in Grey Lancer, this is one of my favorite books in general when it comes to superpowered vampires. So it's going to sound a bit, what do you say? Well, honestly, I think they should the guy who translated this should be translating this one, in my opinion. So I recommend that you read the Vampire Hunter D books, or watch the movies, the original video animations, because it's very worth getting into the let's say the mythos of Vampire Hunter D. It has a bit of a Lovecraftian side to it. Some things felt a lot like Lovecraftian nastiness and deities and such. And if you ever decide to play the video game, if you ever find it like cheap over there, it's not that that special, because the Vampire Hunter D, the character, moves a bit like those characters in Resident Evil. And that's a bit of a contradiction, because in the books and the films, Vampire Hunter D looks like almost like imagine that Superman couldn't fly, but had sort of like samurai powers, a bit like that, much slower than Superman, but he feels just incredibly powerful. He's swinging, jumping, running all over the place, and his sword almost feels like a lightsaber, because it cuts through almost everything. And so I think that's what damaged the video game quite a bit, that it feels like you're playing Vampire Hunter D Resident Evil style. You feel a bit like stiff and not moving as fast as what Vampire Hunter D would move. And seriously, I'm going to put a trailer below that it looks a bit blurry, but I think it's the trailer that best communicates the action scenes of Vampire Hunter D. And well, thanks for watching this lengthy video of my thoughts on Vampire Hunter D. I could have talked a lot more about Vampire Hunter D, but I think this covers the basics, especially the basics of what I like of Vampire Hunter D, and it keeps in theme with this month of October of all things creepy and Halloweeny. So thanks for watching my video. If you have any comments or questions, please let me know. See you later.